be covering the constitutional development of India. Now, the Regulating Act was passed in 1773. The act which made the provision for the first time for the post of Governor General of Bengal was the Regulating Act of 1773. Supreme Court was set up for the first time in India under the Regulating Act of 1773. The first Chief Justice of Supreme Court established by East India Company was Elijah Amphie. The act which gave the right to reject the decision of the committee to Governor General was the Act of 1786. The act which empowered Lord Cornwallis to overrule the decisions of his council was the Act of 1786. By a regulation in 1793, the district collector was deprived of his judicial power and made the collecting agent only. The reason for such regulation was Lord Cornwallis was alarmed at the extent of power concentrated in district collector and felt that such absolute power was undesirable in one person. The monopoly of East India Company in India's trade was abolished in 1813. The correct statement regarding the Charter Act of 1813 are: it ended the trade monopoly of East India Company in India except for the trade in tea and trade with China. It asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over the Indian territories held by the company. It is one of the reasons for considering Charter Act of 1813 important for India. It meant financial allocation for education for Indian people. Out of the given options, namely, the trading activities of East India Company were abolished to designation of Supreme Court authority was to be changed as the Governor General of India in Council, all lawmaking powers to be conferred on Governor General in Council, and Indian was appointed as law member of the Governor General Council, which provision was not made in the Charter Act of 1833. An Indian was to be appointed, so this provision was not in there. That they because Makule was the law member, first law member, so this provision is not there. That which had recommended to hold the Indian civil service examination simultaneously in India and England was the Montagu Chelmsford Reforms Report. The act which provisioned competitive exam system for civil services was the Charter Act of 1853. The act which for the first time created a functioning legislature council in India was the Charter Act of 1853. The year in which British government finally agreed to hold Indian civil services examination simultaneously in India and England was 1922 AD. The correct matched list is Establishment of Board of Control by Pitt's India Act of 1783-84. Establishment of Supreme Court by Regulating Act of 1773. Permission of appointment of Christian missionaries in the British Indian territories, Charter Act of 1813. Law member in Governor General's Council, Charter Act of 1833. Now, the correct matched are Act of Council, Colonial Government of India provisions. Now, these acts and provisions are matched. By Regulating Act of 1773, the company directors were asked to present to the British government all correspondence and document pertaining to the administration of the company. Charter Act of 1813, company's trade monopoly in India was ended. Act of 1858, the power to govern was transferred from East India Company to British Crown, Pitt's India Act set up a board of control in Britain to fully regulate East India Company, by which act British Parliament had abolished the monopoly of East India Company's trade in India except for tea and China trade. Answer is Charter Act of 1813. Under which act Board of Control was established. Answer is Pitt's India Act of 1784. British East India Company lost monopoly of tea trade by the Charter Act of 1813. The act which transferred the Government of India from East India Company to Crown was the Government of India Act 1858. The correct statement is under the Government of India Act 1858, the British Parliament abolished the East India Company altogether and undertook the responsibilities of ruling India directly. The act which empowered Governor General of India to issue ordinances was the Indian Council Act of 1861. The Act of British India which strengthened the Viceroy's authority over his executive council by substituting portfolio or departmental system for cooperating functioning, was the Indian Council Act of 1861. The act by which British for the first time introduced the system of indirect election in India was 1892. To control the media in India, acts were passed in 1835, 1867, 1878, and 1908. The High Courts were established in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta in the year 1862. The most short lived of all Britain's constitutional experiments in India among the Council of India Act 1861, Indian Council Act of 1892, Indian Council Act of 1909, and Government of India Act of 1919 was the Indian Council Act of 1909. Moving on, the Declaration of Reforms on August 20, 1917 is known as Montague Declaration. Montague Kempsford Report formed the basis of the Government of India Act 1919. The report of Indian High Commission was created by which act? Answer is the Government of India Act 1919. The principle of diarchy was introduced by the Act of 1919. The one who is considered as the father of diarchy is Sir Lionel Curtis. The real intention of British to include the princely states in federal union proposed by the Indian Act of 1935 was to use the princes to counterbalance the anti-imperialistic doctrines of the nationalistic leaders. The Government of India Act 1935 provided for provincial autonomy, the establishment of federal court, the All India Federation at the center. Now, an assertion and a reasoning. Diarchy means division of administrative affairs in two sections. Reasoning is it was introduced for enforcement of the responsible governance in provinces. Both a assertion and reasoning are true, but reasoning is the correct explanation of assertion. Now, the truth statement are after the Nagpur session of 1920 of Congress, the Provincial Congress Committee were constituted on linguistic basis. In 1948, Congress rejected the demand for formation of provinces on linguistic basis. It was included in the prime elements of the Government of India Act of 1935, that is, the formation of federation and provincial autonomy. The Government of India Act 1935 is important because it is the main source of Indian Constitution. Out of the given options, namely diarchy at the center as well as provinces, a bicameral legislature, provincial autonomy, All India Federation, which is not a feature of the Government of India Act 1935, that is diarchy at center as well as at provinces. The Government of India Act 1935 was based on the Simon Commission report. The one who said about the Act of 1935, a car which had a brake with no engine, was Jawaharlal Nehru. He who had called the Government of India Act 1935 as Charter of Slavery was Jawaharlal Nehru. The act that introduced the principle of constitutional autocracy was Government of India Act 1935. The instrumentation of instruction contained in the Government of India Act 1935 had been incorporated in the Constitution of India in the year 1950 as directive principles of the state policy. The one who had said it, I had not to beg pardon in connection with the allegations in the draft of Constitution, a major of part of the Government of India Act 1935 had been reproduced, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Now, the correctly matched list is Regulating Act of 1773 with the establishment of Supreme Court, Indian Council Act of 1909 with the introduction of communal electorates, Government of India Act 1919 with the introduction of diarchy, Government of India Act 1935 with the provision of autonomy of provinces. The session in which Indian National Congress had rejected Government of India Act 1935 was the Lucknow session of 1936. In the provisions of India Government of India Act 1935, residuary powers were given to the Governor General. Government of India Act 1935 abolished provincial diarchy. The Council of India was abolished by Government of India Act 1935. That'll be all for this video. We'll be continuing with modern history miscellaneous sections in the next video.